Hello, dear ones. Welcome to another conversation on the different shades and shapes of love. The kind of conversation I think we must have more of. As always, before we start, can I invite you to take a moment of centering and breathing with me? Please sit down with your back up, drop your shoulders, relax, close your eyes, breathe. Inhale deeply, exhale slowly. Inhale deeply, exhale slowly. Inhale deeply, exhale slowly. When you're ready, gently open your eyes. Now listen with your heart. Today's shade of love is seek. Seek was the love that saw me proclaimed, I don't know, and began to recover the innocence of mystery, of mystics, faith, and everything spiritual. I remember the wide-eyed delight I had at the Taoist customs practiced by Ama, my grandma, sometimes in elaborate expressions, like how the tallest of sugarcane must be had for every 9th day of the Lunar New Year, complete with a whole suckling pig as part of a sumptuous offering to the King of Heaven. I also kept company with good friends at church through sermons and mass, and abstained from pork for a period of time like my Muslim kakis, which means buddies. These experiences were decidedly more cultural than religious. Ma is also a devout follower of Guan Yin, the goddess of mercy, yet she and Ba inculcated a moral compass in us through the way they live and not through specific doctrines. I am immensely grateful for this because they gave me the space to explore my own path of spirituality when I was ready, even if under agonizing circumstances. I became a seeker when the crushing despair I could not make sense of led me to find answers in 4 different temples of faith: Church of the Sacred Heart, Guan Yin Donghutjo, Sri Krishna Mandir, and Sultan Mosque. I got chased out of this last one. And the esoteric modalities of tarot, angel healing, shamanic reading, rebirthing, breathwork, goddess within, family constellations, Reiki, and yoga. In this unencumbered search across the traditions, what I saw was not differences, but the singularity of their unifying truth: love. This curiosity from the crushing despair that led me to seek the wisdom of life and light reminds me of the epiphytes on the old rain trees in Singapore to pair with for this shade. In the deep, dark tropical rainforest, sunlight is the most limiting natural resource, and all plants are constantly seeking light through the many diverse paths. The old rain trees we have are host to a large number of epiphytes like ferns and orchids, which thrive and flourish as they move up towards the light, much like I did and still am on this path of seeking. I may have been curious about religions, but I was never called to any at all for most part of my life until 15 years ago, when life as I knew it collapsed in such an epic manner that I started to question what life was all about. From being close to any forms of religion or spirituality practice, I swung completely the other way to being unashamedly open to all the mystery and mystics. Because of how we've been taught about religion and spirituality here in Singapore, I naturally thought I should give the 4 main religions another go, which is why I ended up attending a mass at the Catholic Church, meditating in the middle of the bustling halls of the Buddhist temple, quietly holding the joysticks and listening to the bells and chants at the Hindu temple, and didn't get beyond the front steps of the mosque because obviously I was not appropriately dressed. Yet, all this seeking from different sources, former religions, New Age, traditional pagan practices keeps leading me to love till today. So I've been saying love when asked about my religion, since including when I had to fill in the very official application form to be a nominated member of parliament. It's a wonder, but also a testament of our multi-religious stance that I got selected, I guess. When I was thinking of who I would like to have a conversation with on this shade of love on religion, spirituality, and humanity, I immediately thought of my learned friend whom I enjoyed these conversations with. He's none other than Mohamed Imran Mohamed Taib. Imran already had a sterling reputation as one of Singapore's foremost interfaith and multiculturalism experts when I first reached out to him to meet after stepping down from Parliament. I was then increasingly concerned with some of the right-wing and conservative ideas that I was hearing from certain religious groups and wanted to understand more from him. You know how you conjure up these images of religious scholars with long beards and robes? Imran completely disappoints when he showed up looking no different to my kawans from the neighbourhood. In fact, when I later moderated the civil society conversation after the general elections in 2020, when I asked all the 9 panelists, of which Imran was one of them, to describe themselves in a 7-word biography, my friend's first attempt was enjoys robust conversations over tarik. Now, how unscholarly is that, right? Imran is also the co-founder of Centre for Interfaith Understanding, or CIFU, which strives to strengthen the multi-religious fabric that weaves all of Singapore together by advocating for deeper discourse amongst various faiths through dialogue, training, and curriculum development. I really like the witty CIFU or SIFU acronym. Hey, Imran.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi,
thank you so much for bravely saying yes to being part of this podcast experiment.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. So we are going to discuss love, and to call on love, I think it's really important to call on love more as we look at the pressing issues of our time, right?
Yeah.
So, I just want to share this encounter that I had, right? When my friend's then 10-year-old son asked me a few years ago what my religion was. And obviously I said yes. I said love, right? He then immediately retorted and said, Auntie, that's just lame. Love is not a religion. Right? What do you think of his remark? And when my professing that my religion is love?
Well, you should ask him to explain what he meant by that. I think there is a lot of wisdom in saying that love is an essential element of religion. Because if you take that equation out of religion, then you are emptying it of the very essence of what religion is supposed to be, and how it should operate in this world. Because I think we cannot live in this world without this element of love. And that's the very basis of life itself. It's our love towards ourselves, towards others, towards the environment around us that actually sustains life. Take that out of the equation and what we have will be death and destruction.
Right. Wow. Okay. Let's explore that a little bit. So that's going to make me ask you, obviously, an important question for this shade, right? What does religion, spirituality, and culture mean to you? And is there a difference for you in the 3 words that I've just said in that one sentence? Religion, spirituality, and culture.
Yeah, I mean, personally, of course, I see a distinction between the 3 categories. But of course, there will be people who will define it differently. But for me personally, I think religion is something that is constructed through the experience of the human and through time. And this is how ideas on religion is also shaped by the contingencies of that particular period, that particular society. But then it expresses something that is much more eternal. It expresses the essence of what it means to be human, which is about making meaning. It's about asking questions that cannot be answered by science, for example. Science can explain why or rather how certain things
yes, I was going to
occur.
say. That's right.
But it doesn't explain the deepest questions that humanity have. Why is there something rather than nothing? So that actually engages the human in the pursuit for meaning, for the ultimate reality, and that gives birth to the impulse towards uncovering the divine mystery. And that's how religion then takes shape through ordering of society, through implementing rituals in order to bring out that element of the search for the divine and build communities. Spirituality is something that is very individual, something personal,
right?
Because it speaks about your inner yearning to make sense of this ultimate reality, to reach out to something beyond the material world, that is something worthy outside ourselves. And of course, it speaks about the destiny, not just of yourself, but also the whole of creation, if you look at it from that way.
Or life.
Or
right?
life itself, But then, of course, humans can't operate as individuals or in isolation. So we have to build communities, and communities need to be guided by certain norms and values. And that is what religion provides, that stability that brings us forward as humans, and build civilizations. I think religion is necessary in order to forward a civilization that has brought us to where we are right now. But the core and the essence of it has to be that spiritual need and tendencies in all of us to go beyond ourselves.
Such a lot to ponder over what you just shared, right? How do you then bring what you've just shared about religion, which, as you said, is constructed and provides, if you will, a frame, right?
Yes.
For us to come together as a community, as a civilization, and then and that dance between that which is outer with spirituality, which is inner at a personal level. How does these two come together and juxtaposed into culture as we know it? Yeah.
So culture is another complicated term,
right? I know, yeah.
But maybe I give this analogy. Spirituality is something like water that sustains life, and we all need water in order to nourish us and continues that life process. But how we drink water takes the form of the cups that might be different to individuals or even to groups or to the context. Some people prefer to drink it from a cup. Some people drink it from a bottle. And those forms...
From a tap.
Or tap even, yeah.
Right.
But what we can't deny is that there's something common there. That is the water, pure water that actually sustains life. Of course, sometimes you say the problem is sometimes the water can get dirty, can be mixed with other elements, and it's not really nourishing. And religion can be like that too, if mixed with other unhealthy elements. Then it can actually diminish the real potential of religion. But we can't deny that there's spirituality even in the water that is being that's adulterated, Yeah. But we need to be able to tell what is good and what is not. But ultimately, we need to share the water also. And we just don't say, only we can drink this water and we deny it to other people also. So I think there's a lot of complicated elements there. And culture is actually part and parcel of this whole human experience too. Because culture develops from our own response to our own needs and our own conditions and contexts, and the need also for community.
And traditions.
And traditions,
as well. Customs, traditions. Don't
Correct. I mean, if you talk about the essential element of religion, the central human values that is encapsulated in religion, that needs to be transmitted intergenerationally. And it's culture that plays that role of transmission of values. But we must be careful to see culture not as something that is static, that doesn't change. Culture evolves, and culture responds to the changing context of time. But the central values that binds cultures together is what we ought to uphold and Continue.
Wow, yes, you're right. There's so many levels to unpack there, and we're barely just into the conversation. To carry on the energy, if religion is kind of the cup, so to speak, and then that is the water is the spirituality, what would you say would be culture as part of that?
Well, culture is, well, maybe we can put it in another analogy. It's like, if we are searching for water, we dig deep under the ground, right? And that's where we come to the source of it, which is the water that is deep underground. And different religions will have different ways of digging through
to get to that
source.
Well done, yes.
And culture is the area in which we look for that source.
Ah, beautiful. Okay, right. Yeah, so different parts of it, the location almost.
The location of it, yeah.
Yeah.
So I may be born in a particular village, for example, and I'm influenced by the habits and practices of the villagers there. But then we all have to dig underground for that source of water that will sustain that village and keep it going. And that's where religion comes in terms of providing that kind of norms and stability for us to work together in order to get to that source. But eventually we will discover that there are other villages and we have to work together, right? We cannot be saying that we have to invade another village in order to steal their water, or we can't poison their water, or we can't say only our water is nourishing and the others
or only our water is water.
Yeah,
right.
And I think sometimes the religion can be that too, it can be, it can take a cooperative mode, or it can also take a more hostile mode. It depends on how the villagers themselves see religion and define it. So I would say that religion has two sides of it.
Of course, yeah. And I think that's where we are, I think, right now, right?
Exactly.
Across the world, and in terms of understanding, exploring, discussing about this topic of religion. Now let's come back to you, right? So what or how do you seek? And I think I would like to also add on to that about what about your childhood shaped you in what you do today? Let's get back to Imran so that our listeners understand a little bit more and connect with you also.
Of course, I'm also a person that's conditioned by the time and the location. And I was born in a Malay Muslim family. And my parents, or rather my entire family, we were living as an extended family. Which is quite normal at the time,
Yes. I went through that too, yes.
Where today it's more nuclear families, but back then, whole 2-3 generations were living under one roof. And our sense of religiosity is one that is also intertwined and mixed with cultural practices.
Sure.
Malay cultural practices. So religion and culture was very much intertwined. And therefore my understanding of religion was shaped by the kind of cultural nuances and practices of the Malay community. And of course, we don't make a distinction between religion and culture. We see this as part of how it's supposed to be,
Right. There's already that osmosis almost, right? That have come in using the water, water's analogy,
But it's interesting that I observed, because I grew up in the 1980s all the way to 1990s, that over time, people make a distinction. The distinction between culture and religion become much more marked, especially within the Malay community.
Okay.
So that's an interesting phenomenon, because in the period of the 1980s, there was an attempt to define religion and culture as two separate categories. And of course, the religious identity then become much more stronger as we arrive at the late 1980s. So personally, that was my experience also.
Yeah, no, that's important. So your lived experience is that you felt that there was this change that happened as you were growing up.
Yeah.
That there was, first of all, that decoupling between race and religion.
Yes.
And then you felt that
the religious identity becomes stronger.
Yeah.
Particularly within the context of Malay society at that time.
What then, when you were a young man, what came to you when you felt this change or this shift, of that religious identity becoming more dominant than the racial identity, right?
Yeah. Of course, teenagers at that time, you were exploring our own identities, trying to find our own position in the world. And around me, the religious identity was getting stronger and stronger. And I was swept through that phenomenon also. So I saw myself as becoming more attracted towards religion and questioning myself, what does it mean to be a Muslim? So I shouldn't be a Muslim simply because I was born a Muslim, simply because I grew up in a Muslim family, but I must be consciously Muslim.
I love that. Please share more. So then what happened? What then was that? Where did that take you in terms of that curiosity and that almost a declaration, right? You just almost sound like you made a declaration as a young man.
Well, it's interesting because normally when someone rediscover a new identity, they become very zealous about it.
I'm actually currently pointing to myself. The listeners might not see this, right? Yeah. So that's what the chapter was a bit about, right? That I was very zealous, very open, and very actually just super curious, and very drawn, and there was a longing. Yeah. So please share your experience when you were a young man.
Well, on one hand, there will be people who start to open up and try to explore different facets of religion and all that.
Yes.
But for me, my experience was something else.
Right.
I adopt a more exclusivist identity.
Okay.
So defining myself as a Muslim first before anything else. And then by that, you have to define the boundaries of what is being Muslim and what is not Muslim.
Exactly.
So it becomes quite a binary way of thinking about issues. And of course, that was in the past. And eventually, I grew out of that phase. And
how did you do that?
Well,
what got you to go from? And thank you for sharing. I think that's really important, right? Especially given that we all have. I'm sure different listeners out there would relate to what you just shared. Some will relate to, of course, what I shared, right? Where I'm just completely open, doesn't matter whatever it is, right? It's to do with spirituality. But how did that shift happen for you from, moving from one which is really declaring you want to be consciously Muslim? I actually think that's a really beautiful declaration. Finding out that there was a bit of a binary stance that you were taking, to then moving into what you are right now, which is an interfaith, advocate.
So, I guess it's a process. It was not an overnight shift.
Of course, yeah.
And one of the key factors, I think, was the fact that I met a lot of non-Muslims, and I engaged in deep conversations with them. Initially, of course, my conversation was just to assure me that my religion is right and his religion is wrong. That was the impetus for having that conversation in the first place. But I did not imagine that it will transform me. Eventually the conversation veered into everyday matters. We were young, we were in our early youth, and we were talking. Okay, after a while we got bored talking about religion, which is natural. Right?
Yeah.
And we are bored debating about religious
right,
issues.
Intellectualizing.
Yeah. And we began to talk about, hey, what do you do in your free time? What movies you like. It actually humanizes the whole conversation.
Of course, yeah.
And from there, I began to see there's much more to life. And there's much more commonalities that actually can bind us together, despite our disagreements on theological issues, on religious issues. And we develop friendship. I think that was the first stage. And you begin to see the person beyond his or her religious category. And see the person just as another human being with their own struggles, their own aspirations, their own dreams.
And relating to those very human experiences.
Exactly.
Right?
And it also pushes me to reflect on my own life experiences. And I can relate to that. I can relate to the struggles, the aspirations that I want. And so after that phase, then, of course, I was exposed to a lot more readings. And in my early youth, I was fortunate enough to be able to get in touch with several religious scholars because I was volunteering in a Muslim organization. So sometimes the scholars would come from overseas, and then I'll be privileged enough to sit at the same dinner table, and I can ask lots of questions. And I was very curious. And it expanded my mind. But it also comes from a position where I think we need to be courageous ourselves.
Yeah.
We need to be able to doubt.
Yes.
And I think for some people that can be scary.
Yeah.
Because when you question yourself, then it kind of disoriented you. Because, okay, what I believe or assume throughout my life, and suddenly it comes to a point where I say, oh no, there's something not right there. It can actually be quite scary. But I think that is the step that we have to make. Because we have to get the philosophy right. And to me, doubt is the beginning of knowledge.
Of course.
Cannot acquire knowledge without first emptying yourself of your pre-assumptions and your sense of having the absolute truth. Because if you feel that what you know is already absolute and complete, then there's no way you can take in any new knowledge. In fact, it can even lead you to a phase of arrogance.
Yes.
And I think the real problem now is, especially in the tensions between the religious communities, is arrogance and ego. If we can diffuse that and we can say, look, we are all pilgrims.
Yes.
Yeah, we are all pilgrims in this life.
This journey,
In this journey. And let's walk together. And let's look out for each other.
We've not arrived yet, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to me, the more I know that I do not know.
Yes, exactly. I was just going to say that.
One analogy I can give is like a circle where inside the circle is things that you know, and outside the circle are things that you do not know. And your contact between the known and the unknown is the circumference of the circle. As you acquire more knowledge and your circle gets bigger, your circumference also gets bigger. So the more you know, the more you do not know.
Yes. And in fact, what you do not know outside of the circle, it's actually almost infinite.
Exactly.
Right? Unless you draw a line yourself and you create a concentric circle and all that. So that's a great visualization, and I hope the listeners are doing what I'm doing, because I was actually visualizing in my head. I think those are such important tips and also practices. In some way, I think being courageous, Imran, being courageous, being curious, in itself is a practice. Because doing it for the first time, it's so uncomfortable, particularly if you are born into a certain set of practices, customs, or traditions, right? To break out of it is to break out of an identity, So in itself is a practice. And it gets more comfortable, as we do more of it. Going back to what you said initially when you were born into obviously having, the coming together, the juxtaposition of race and religion, right? Being in a Malay Muslim setting and environment. I want to go back to that. And I also want to remind Imran, who may have forgotten this, but also sharing with the listeners. So that first 7-word biography that he tried, obviously I said no lah, because I'm like, how unscholarly is that? But what we did was he actually, or you, I would say, you finally landed with listen to all voices, even in disagreement, right? So that's actually nicely fitting into 7 words, which I think really encapsulate what you talked about earlier, right? Your experiences as a young man, hanging out with people of different faiths and trying to first of all argue, your way out and saying that your faith is the right one, to still listening. And I think because you listen even in disagreement is actually open up a whole new, bigger, wider circumference that we talked about, right? So I think it was very good. And like I said, it so definitely describes what you do, right? Now, I don't think we can talk about religious diversity in the multicultural DNA of Singapore without talking about race. And you mentioned that yourself, right? As someone born into a Muslim, Malay Muslim family, the religious identity took dominance. So let's talk about, do you feel more Malay or do you feel more Muslim?
Okay. So I think this is the part where I mentioned earlier that in my exploratory stage, in my adolescence and also in my early youth, I began to adopt a stronger Islamic identity.
Yeah.
But now I realize that there could be some social factors that actually push me towards heightening up my religious identity.
Okay.
It's because I realized that at that time, the Malay identity is seen very negatively. There's a lot of stereotypes about being Malay. You're lazy, you cannot make it in life. And youths, they want to feel empowered. And they were exploring for a different identity that can give them that kind of voice and empowerment. And at that time, there was also the rise of religious identity, politics around the world. And we felt that we want to belong to this global religious identity that somehow gives us that kind of meaning and empowerment. Because the Malay identity, at that time, a lot of Malays of my generation were trying to dissociate ourselves even from Malay culture because it's seen as backward. It's seen as very kampung lah. So this is something that I realize now. So that is that kind of internalized racism that a lot of Malay youths were facing at that time. Even, in fact, I would say even today. So that's probably the reason why I chose the Islamic identity or the Muslim identity has something that is primary. But of course, now we realize that, of course, we don't have to choose one over the other. Our identities are complex anyway. And we can have multiple identities. And which identity comes first depends on the context and the situations. Just like my identity as a father, as a husband, and as a child. When I'm meeting with my parents, of course, my identity as a child of my parents comes first, With my wife, is my identity as a spouse. With my children, I'm the father. So we can have that also. And we don't have to say one has to triumph over the other. We are all complex creatures and we have to recognize that.
How do you think one can actually, so in some ways this is very ontological, right? That sense of self, which really relates to the identity that you are talking about. How do you think we can be more aware of these distinctions as much as also not be too seduced by the distinctions of the different identities? You know what I mean? I remember, I can't remember his name now, but there was a Sufi poet that talked about, it might be Bulleh Shah actually, who talked about, the scattered selves. How do we gather our scattered selves into, the one self? But at the same time, as you said, because of the context in which our identity then gets called up, right? Within that context, it's not to forget about the different identities, but how do you do it such that you don't get sort of drawn to one in such a primary manner that everything else becomes secondary and recessive? I
think why people are drawn towards one particular identity only is because they have to define themselves in relation to what they are not.
In relation to what they are not.
Yes.
Okay,
let me give you an example. Myself.
Spoken like a true philosopher.
Let's take me as an example, right? My great grandmother, from my father's side, comes from Punjab. In India.
Okay, I didn't know that, listeners.
My great grandfather, from my father's side also, came from Java. So they married. My father becomes Malay. My grandfather Malay. My father becomes Malay. I'm Malay, right? Okay, let's take my wife for example. My mother-in-law, my wife's mother, was actually a Chinese and adopted by a Malay family. Grew up as a Malay, and she identifies herself as Malay, which was common in those times.
Absolutely.
Whereas her father, my wife's father, is Javanese. So my children now will have three ancestry. Indian, Malay, Chinese. So what are we? On identity card, we have to choose one, and that's Malay.
Because of the CMIO.
Because of the CMIO.
Model,
So a lot of these racial identities are actually constructed.
Very
and
much,
it suits a particular purpose of governance to make things easy, to form structures in which to govern and also to dish out certain provisions. But we have to know that our identities are much more complex, and all of us, I would say, are hybrid.
Yeah, and therein lies the challenge there, right?
Yeah.
When we are being, and I would even use the words artificially, being constructed, being led to believe that this is the category, this is the identity that you should be, associating yourself or identifying yourself with, then we very clearly would lose the other aspects of ourselves. Especially if these identities are constructed for us and in the larger context, you want to feel belong within that society, right?
Of course, like if I have to make a decision, what am I, right? Given
That's why I asked you,
this
right?
mixed ancestry,
exactly.
right? So eventually, let's say I settled for Malay, then I have to define it. Why Malay and why not Chinese? Why not Indian? So the moment I have to define it, I have to define it in terms of what I'm not. And this is the in-group, out-group that is natural, and the way you have the time you have to decide on that, then you will define yourself in relation to what you're not. So I'm Malay because I'm different from the Chinese, I'm different from the Indian. And I think that's fundamentally the problem. Because when we have to define our boundaries, when our boundaries are actually much more fluid,
and also artificially constructed in some cases,
then we begin to think in terms of what we are in relation to what we are not. And I think Singapore is evolving in that manner. Eventually, we have to see ourselves not through this lens of defining ourselves in terms of what we are and what we are not, but finding where it intersects and finding that
what we all are.
We all are, that we are just one sum of an entire whole. And therefore, we see ourselves not as separate, but as different, and yet we are all part of the same circle, Going back to the idea of religion, right? So to me, religion is an important element in my life. But how I see religion is based on the values that religion promotes. And these values are universal values and human values. And I think that informs me on how I ought to relate to someone from a different race, for example. So I don't define it in very exclusivist terms, but rather in universal terms, like that religion teaches. Like, for example, love, care, compassion, justice, equality. These to me are religious values, and it's central to my religion. And this is how I ought to relate to people who are of a different ethnicity from me. So, Anthea, I see you. Of course, you are Chinese.
Well, I'm not actually. I'm Malay. And as you were saying about your descent and your ethnic,
in your identity card.
No lah. Of course, the C is big lah.
We have to choose, right?
Yeah, we have to choose. I think that's why. I do think that that's something that we need to, discuss more of course, in terms of that. So.
But I relate to you through these values, that what binds us together is we are committed to promoting the same kind of human and universal values.
So I think this is very important. One really important thing that we must discuss is you talked about values, right? That comes to religion. And I think going back to the very first question, I think our values are shaped by religion, spirituality, culture, right? Our social norms and practices, right? That we have been accustomed to. But we tend to focus. Do you think that primarily our values? So in terms of the dominance, do you think religion would actually shape the value more than the other two? Or do you think it's really, again, just a position of these three coming together that shape our values? And where I'm going is if our values come from a combination of religion, race and culture, right, spirituality, what I see here in Singapore is that we often focus on the multiracial diversity and inclusion in our policies. right? Like CNIO, as we talked about quite a bit, and the ethnic integration policy in housing. And even in political representation, right? Like the GRC, it's been based on race, right? But we had talked about in this conversation so far that actually values don't just come from race, it comes from religion, it comes from culture.
Yeah.
So do you think we're doing enough though to make sure that in these policies and this representation, we're also looking at religious diversity, not just racial diversity?
That's a tough question.
And that's a question we've actually had conversations about in the past, remember?
Yeah.
Not over tarik, because I had to take my vegan tea.
Well, I think each country will have their own historical reasons why they focus on each identity. So Singapore, of course, being part of the British colony in the past, and it was the British who instituted this CMIO
that's right.
And this racial categorization, and we somehow continue that. So that's the historical context. It's not easy to move away. I can understand why we can't overnight do away with these categories. But then now you're saying that there's an added element of religious identity and diversity
and representation
that comes in. I think there are already avenues for religious representation in devising some of our policies, particularly those affecting religious communities. We do have like the Presidential Council for Religious Harmony, where apex religious leaders will be there to advise, and also the government seek their advice in terms of certain policies that might affect the religious communities. Of course, we can also say that some of our politicians are deeply informed by their own religious values, and there's nothing wrong with that. And we can't say that people have to totally make a demarcation between their religious identity and their secular identity when they are parliamentarians and all that.
Well, because we are a whole person.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
And this value, like you said, is so deep within us. It defines
but of course,
us.
We have to take into account that when we devise policies, it has to be fair across the communities, right? So we have to bear that in mind, even though we can't say that I leave my religious identity at the door when I enter Parliament. You can't do that. Also,
it doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work
that
way.
That's not how the sense of self.
And there's a lot of avenues where religious leaders are consulted. We have the interracial and religious confidence circle at every constituency, and engages with the government a lot. So we do have that in place. So I see that as not short of religious representations in terms of providing inputs to policies, which eventually is the government's purview to make and devise those policies. So I don't think we need to add another layer and say we must have religious representations formally.
Sure. But I think that it's important that the awareness is there.
I think it's important to be conscious of it.
Yes.
Because we don't want a situation where people are actually acting on their religious ideas, but they do not articulate that. And it seems all secular. So it's better to be conscious about it and to be upfront and to not to make it as a taboo.
Yes, exactly.
So at least we are transparent and we are able to engage and talk about it, and we can try to find common grounds where our values can actually meet and we share the same values. Of course, the details of it might need to be worked out, because what we mean by equality might differ according to different person, right? But at least we can see that we all want the same good thing.
Equality. Yes, we all want equality. Yes,
and we want this country to flourish and move forward. One of the favorite books that I like is actually by Psychoanalysis and Religion by this German thinker Erich Fromm, and he categorized religion as the two orientations. One is the humanistic type of religion and the authoritarian type of religion. I think it's the good for all of us to explore the humanistic side of religion and to always check on the authoritarian dimensions of religion.
Right.
Because there's always a connection between the authoritarian personality, authoritarian religion, and our authoritarian political culture.
Yeah.
If we are brought up in an authoritarian environment and we view religion through this lens where, punishment,
Yes.
hell, fire, and all that.
Condemnation. Yeah.
It's also how we will like live our life in fear, in anxiety, and always feeling under siege,
yeah.
which actually inhibits us from exploring our humanistic side, which is creative, which is full of love, compassion.
And also this concept that Aristotle talked about, which is eudaimonia, which is human flourishing.
Yep.
Right? And that comes from that space of feeling supported, feeling the love, and feeling the space
and the confidence to explore the world.
Yeah, and to be the best human that you can be, right? Yep. So quick wrap up. What's your key takeaway in this conversation? What?
There's a lot that we have discussed.
I know, right? I know. I mean, we could actually really go on for a long time, which we always do, right? A few times that we caught up, it just keeps going on. We always overrun our...
Well, I always learn something new from every conversations that I have. And for today, I think it leads me to think a little bit more about how we can explore this humanistic aspect of our own religion, our own culture, or our own identity, so that we can open up that space to see how we connect with the others through these values, rather than through this definition of rigid boundaries of our identities, our religion, or even our cultures, etc. So thank you so much for having me here. I really enjoyed the conversation.
No, me too. I mean, it feels like we are having a cup of tarik with each other, right? Except that he's actually having a cup of coffee, and I'm having a bottle of kombucha. But thank you so much, Imran. I mean, for me, it's I love your analogies. So your metaphors, your analogies were very very vivid, and I think very on point, and certainly allows us to sort of make sense of some of this complex, nuance, but so important reflections we must make, right? So especially for me is the well, how you have to dig deep to find the source, and that we all have different ways of getting to that source, right? But we are all going towards the source because we all need water.
Yeah.
And to survive and to sustain life. And that's what spirituality is in terms of the water. But the way we get into that depth where we all hit water, that's actually religion, and also a combination of culture in terms of where we get that, right? Yeah.
And just one last point is we are the stories that we tell.
We are lah. Yeah.
And
so
I think
choose very carefully the story you want to tell about yourself.
No, what
is that what you're saying?
What I can learn is that you are in my story.
Yeah.
And others who I've met in my life, they are part of my story. So it's our story, actually.
It is our story.
And that's how we tell them to others.
It's a tapestry, right? We just keep adding, right?
Yep.
Yeah, just keep
and that's
adding.
The beauty of it.
It is, but I must say that just to finish off, I also say that I'm very, very heartened because I feel very validated. I think I will absolutely continue to profess my religion as love, because I think after this conversation, I'm even more convinced. That I will not that I'm going to create a new religion, don't get me wrong. I have no interest in wearing robes and having long beards, but I definitely think that love is something to think about, but because of what we have discussed today, especially about the humanistic aspects of it. So thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you so much, Imran.
Thank you.
So we're going to wrap up, but as always, we always share with our listeners, use some of the resources. And for today's conversation, these resources came to mind, but there are many that I may have missed out. So you can find some of the links on our show notes and social media posts. I hope this would be of value for our listeners out there. So, of course, first and foremost, Center for Interfaith Understanding, SIFU. There's also the IRO, or the Interreligious Organization, which Imran, before we started, also shared with me that it is the oldest surviving interfaith organization in the world. We founded it in 1949, which is pre-independence of Singapore. There are several youth-oriented groups, such as Being Bridges, Roses of Peace, and also the Interfaith Youth Circle. Not exhaustive list, so many out there, which is a wonderful, wonderful testament of how we have more people, especially the young, being more interested in coming together to discuss these issues. There's also More Than Just Minority Voices and Beyond the Hijab, that looks at outside of the religious issues, but more of the cultural and racial aspects of our society. So we will leave you now with 2 invitations at the end of this episode. What does religion and spirituality mean to you? Is there a difference for you? What beliefs help you move forward, and what holds you back?